"Don't drink that, sir." The words left Grace Holloway's mouth before she could stop them. The silver tray trembled in her hands. A crystal wine glass hovered inches from the lips of the most feared man in Chicago. Red wine caught the chandelier light above them, and on the surface, so thin it could have been mistaken for a reflection, a blue-green sheen drifted across the glass. The room went silent. Not polite silence. Not surprised silence. The kind of silence that arrives when 100 wealthy people suddenly realize something has gone terribly wrong. 3 hours earlier, Grace had been standing in the service hallway behind Moretti's private ballroom, staring at the faded stain on her black apron while the other waitresses adjusted lipstick and checked their reflections in silver serving domes. Her apron was older than most of them. The stitching near the pocket had come loose months ago. She kept meaning to replace it. She never did. Every extra dollar went somewhere else. Her father's medication, the memory care facility, the stack of overdue bills folded inside her locker. "You know this is the VIP floor, right?" one waitress asked. The woman smiled as if she were joking. Her eyes said otherwise. "I'm aware." Grace clipped on her name tag. Just making sure. Some people wander into places they don't belong. Laughter followed. Quiet. Controlled. Sharp enough to draw blood. Grace was used to it. 29 years old. Plus size. Former chemistry student. Current waitress. In most people's minds, the first 3 words erased the fourth. Nobody cared that she had spent 2 years studying food chemistry before dropping out to care for her father. Nobody cared that she still read textbooks during lunch breaks. Nobody cared that she could identify contaminants faster than half the inspectors working for the city. They saw the apron, the weight, the tray, nothing else. The ballroom filled quickly after sunset. Politicians, donors, CEOs, people who smiled with their mouths while measuring each other with their eyes. At the center of it all sat Luca Moretti. Dark suit, notie, silver at his temples. The kind of stillness that made other men lower their voices. Grace had never spoken to him directly. Most staff hadn't. Men like Luca existed on a different floor of reality. Then Evelyn Cross arrived. The city's favorite philanthropist. Future Mrs. Moretti, according to every gossip column. She floated through the room collecting admiration the way candles collect heat. "Everything looks lovely," she told the staff. "Thank you all for your hard work." Polite, warm, perfect. Yet while she spoke, Grace noticed something strange. Evelyn never touched the wine prepared for her. Not once. She lifted glasses, smiled, toasted, but her lips never reached the rim. It was a tiny thing, easy to miss. Grace almost dismissed it herself. Then she saw Evelyn's assistant quietly replace one particular bottle near the VIP table. Not the others, just one. The observation stayed with her, like a splinter beneath the skin. An hour later, service began. Grace carried a silver tray through rows of crystal and candlelight. Someone extended a polished shoe just enough. The tray clipped the edge. Red wine splashed across the front of her apron. Laughter rippled through the room. She lowered her eyes, reached for a napkin, and saw it. Not the spill, not the stain. The faint blue-green shimmer floating across the surface of Luca Moretti's wine. Every sound disappeared. Every insult. Every stare. Every reminder that she didn't belong. Only the glass remained. Then came the warning. Then came the silence. Luca Moretti did not drink. He did not speak. He simply lowered the glass and stared into it. Across the room, for the first time all night, Evelyn Cross stopped smiling. And near the base of the crystal stem, barely visible beneath the wine, Grace noticed a tiny crescent fingerprint made of pale blue residue. The blue residue caught the chandelier light for only a second before the wine swallowed it again. Grace wasn't even sure anyone else had seen it. Luca Moretti's hand remained around the stem of the glass. Not drinking, not setting it down, just holding it. Across the ballroom, conversations had died mid-sentence. A violinist near the stage lowered her bow. Somewhere in the kitchen beyond the double doors, a dish rack crashed onto tile, and the sound seemed impossibly loud. Grace could feel every eye in the room pressing against her skin. The stain on her apron suddenly felt twice as large. "Sir," one of the security men stepped forward. "Would you like us to remove her?" Grace swallowed. There it was. The moment where people like her disappeared. Quietly, efficiently. Luca did not answer right away. His gaze remained on the wine. Then he looked at Grace for the first time. Not at her weight. Not at the spilled wine across her apron. At her face. "Why?" His voice was calm. Almost soft. Somehow that made it worse. Grace could hear her pulse in her ears. "Because something's wrong with that glass." A few people laughed. Nervous laughter. The kind people used when they wanted reality to return to normal. Evelyn Cross stepped forward before anyone else could speak. Her smile remained flawless. "I'm sure Miss Holloway means well." Her hand rested lightly against Luca's arm. "Sometimes people panic when they're overwhelmed." She turned toward Grace with sympathetic eyes that somehow felt colder than anger. "You've had a difficult evening. Why don't we get you some water?" Grace knew that tone. Polite enough for witnesses. Sharp enough to cut. She shook her head. "I'm not overwhelmed." The smile on Evelyn's face tightened by less than an inch. "Of course." Silence settled again. Luca finally lowered the glass onto the tablecloth. The crystal made a small clicking sound against the polished wood beneath. "Keep it." One of the security men blinked. "Sir." "The glass." Luca's eyes never left Grace. "Nobody touches it." Something shifted in the room. Small. Invisible. But real. Evelyn's fingers withdrew from his arm. Grace noticed it because she noticed everything. She always had. The trait had ruined her social life and saved her father from taking the wrong medication more than once. People thought observation was intelligence. It wasn't. Observation was survival. 10 minutes later, she was standing beside the industrial dishwasher in the service corridor. Steam rolled from the machine in hot white waves. Plates rattled. Water hissed through pipes. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. Except nothing felt normal. Anymore. Her hands shook as she wrung out a damp towel. Hell of a stunt. The voice belonged to Marcus, a server nearly twice her age. He stacked dessert plates onto a rolling rack. "If I were you, I'd start looking for another job." Grace didn't answer. Her mind remained fixed on the blue residue, the fingerprint shape, the way Evelyn had reacted before Luca had. Marcus lowered his voice. "You know what bothers me?" Grace glanced up. "What?" He looked toward the ballroom doors. "That's the third time this year somebody's switched Mr. Moretti's drink." The towel stopped moving in her hands. "Third." Marcus immediately regretted speaking. She could see it on his face. "Forget it." "What do you mean third?" "Nothing." He pushed the rack away. Too quickly. "Kitchen gossip." But his eyes moved first. Toward the staff bulletin board near the lockers. Grace waited until he disappeared before crossing the corridor. Shift schedules hung beneath magnets and handwritten notes. Most people would have walked past. Grace didn't. She studied details. Always. Tonight's VIP service sheet listed every assigned server. Every bartender. Every supervisor. Her eyes stopped on one line. Table 14. Luca Moretti's table. The assignment had been changed. Not hours ago. Not yesterday. 23 minutes before guests arrived. Someone had crossed out one bartender's name and replaced it with another. And beside the change sat a supervisor authorization code that didn't belong to anyone currently working in the building. The authorization code sat at the bottom of the schedule like a fingerprint left at a crime scene. Grace stared at it while the hallway hummed around her. The industrial dishwasher roared. Someone laughed near the prep station. A tray of champagne flutes rattled past on a cart. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary night. Yet that single line of numbers made her stomach tighten. She had worked enough shifts to recognize supervisor codes. Every manager had one. Every floor captain had one. This code belonged to neither. She pulled her phone from her apron pocket. The screen was cracked across one corner. An old injury from a subway platform 6 months ago. She opened a photo sheet, taken during employee orientation. a chart listing internal authorization prefixes. The first 2 digits matched a corporate access level reserved for executive administration. Not restaurant staff, not event staff, executive administration. Footsteps approached. Grace locked the screen immediately. Still here. Evelyn's voice floated through the corridor before the woman appeared. Warm, polished, perfect. Grace slipped the phone back into her pocket. Evelyn stood beneath the fluorescent lights looking as immaculate as she had in the ballroom. Not a strand of blonde hair out of place. Not a wrinkle in the ivory fabric of her gown. I wanted to check on you. Her smile was gentle, concerned. The smile of someone who donated children's wings to hospitals and appeared on magazine covers beside rescue dogs. Tonight must have been overwhelming. There it was again. Overwhelming. Not observant. Not concerned. Emotional. Fragile. Grace recognized the tactic because she'd spent her whole life being handed versions of it. You're upset. You're tired. You're sensitive. You're taking things personally. Anything except maybe you're right. I'm fine. Evelyn's smile widened slightly. Of course you are. Her eyes dipped briefly toward Grace's stained apron. Though perhaps after tonight you should take some time off. Stress can make people see things that aren't there. The words were soft, almost kind. Somehow they landed harder than an insult. Grace said nothing. Silence stretched between them. For the first time, Evelyn looked away first. Just for a second. Toward the ballroom. Toward the private elevator beyond the VIP corridor. Then she recovered. Get home safely, Grace. She touched her shoulder lightly before walking away. Grace watched her disappear. The interaction lasted less than a minute. Yet something about it bothered her. Not the words. The timing. Evelyn had crossed half the building to find a waitress she supposedly considered insignificant. That wasn't normal. The realization followed her into the locker room. Most of the staff had already gone home. Metal lockers lined the walls. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Grace opened hers and froze. Her apron wasn't where she'd left it. The black fabric usually hung from a hook inside the door. Tonight it lay crumpled at the bottom like someone had searched through it. She pulled it free. The front pocket had been turned inside out. A small tear stretched along the seam. Her pulse quickened. Someone had gone through her things. Then she felt something inside the pocket. A folded slip of paper. Not hers. She unfolded it carefully. A wine order slip. Table 14. Luca Moretti's table. Time stamped 7:12 p.m. The exact bottle served before the incident. Grace stared at the signature line. She had seen the event coordinator's signature dozens of times on catering paperwork. This wasn't it. The name matched. The handwriting didn't. One letter leaned backward while the rest leaned forward. A detail most people would never notice. Grace did. Because years ago her father had taught forensic accounting before Alzheimer's stole pieces of him one memory at a time. Handwriting mattered. Patterns mattered. She turned the slip over. Her breath caught. Written faintly across the back in blue ink was a second table number. Table 14 had been crossed out. Underneath it someone had originally written Table 9. And Table 9 belonged to Evelyn Cross. Table 9 belonged to Evelyn Cross. Grace stared at the altered wine slip until the numbers blurred. The locker room suddenly felt too small. Too bright. Too quiet. A mistake was one thing. A crossed-out table number was another. She folded the slip carefully and slid it into her pocket beside her cracked phone. Then she headed toward the administrative wing before she could talk herself out of it. The executive dining room sat one floor above the ballroom. Thick carpet swallowed footsteps. Oil paintings lined the walls. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and expensive coffee. Grace felt the familiar pressure of entering a world built for people with different last names and larger bank accounts. A restaurant manager intercepted her halfway down the corridor.
Richard Hale.
Perfect suit. Silver cufflinks. Smile polished to a shine. Miss Holloway. His voice carried professional warmth. I was hoping to find you. That was never a good sign. He guided her toward a private conference room where 3 members of the charity board sat around a long walnut table. crystal water glasses, leather folders, gold pens. Grace remained standing. Nobody offered her a chair. "We simply want to clear up tonight's misunderstanding," Richard said. "For everyone's benefit." He slid a single-page statement across the table. Grace looked down. The document claimed she had misidentified a harmless reflection in the wine after becoming distressed from public embarrassment. The language sounded careful, legal, clean. Every sentence turned her observation into a mistake. "Sign this," Richard said gently, "and we can all move forward." Grace read it twice, then a third time. Her fingers tightened around the paper. "It's not true." One board member sighed quietly. Another exchanged a glance with Richard. Not anger. Worse, pity. "Miss Holloway," an older woman said, "these events can be emotionally overwhelming." There was that word again. Emotional. Overwhelming. Grace placed the statement back on the table. "Then it should be easy to write what actually happened." Silence followed. Small. Heavy. Richard's smile thinned. "You are a waitress." The words remained polite. "There are specialists handling this matter." Grace reached into her pocket and placed the wine order slip beside the ensign statement. "Then one of your specialists should explain this." For the first time, nobody spoke immediately. Richard looked down, just for a second, but Grace saw it. The same way she had seen the sheen on the wine. The same way she noticed mismatched signatures. Tiny things mattered. The conference room door opened. Luca Moretti stepped inside. Nobody had expected him. Chairs shifted instantly. People straightened. Richard recovered first. "Mr. Moretti, we were just resolving a staffing issue." Luca's gaze moved across the room. The ensign statement. The wine slip. Grace standing while everyone else sat. His eyes rested there a moment longer than necessary. "A staffing issue, not a question." Richard nodded. "Miss Holloway appears confused by tonight's events." Grace said nothing. Luca looked at her, then at the statement, then at the empty chair no one had offered her. Something cold settled into the room. He walked to the table and picked up the document. "Read it." "Set it down." "Did she sign it?" Richard blinked. "Not yet." Luca turned toward Grace. "Why not?" Every eye in the room shifted to her. Grace adjusted her crooked name tag, straightened it carefully, then met his gaze. "Because it's false." The room seemed to stop breathing. Luca said nothing for several seconds. No defense. No rescue. Just silence. Dangerous silence. Then he picked up the wine slip instead. His eyes dropped to the signature line. Richard immediately stepped forward. "That document has already been reviewed." Too quickly. Too eagerly. Luca noticed. Grace saw him notice. It was the first crack. Small enough to miss. Large enough to matter. And as Richard reached for the slip, the cuff of his jacket pulled back just enough to reveal an executive access card clipped inside his sleeve. The first 2 digits matched the authorization code that had altered Table 14. The room remained still after Richard's sleeve slipped back. Not frozen. Controlled. The kind of stillness powerful people practiced for years. Richard recovered first. His hand dropped naturally to his side. His smile returned. If he realized what had been exposed, he hid it well. "Executive access cards are common for senior staff," he said lightly. "I'm surprised we're discussing credentials instead of resolving tonight's misunderstanding." Nobody answered immediately. Luca Moretti continued looking at him. Not the card. Him. Grace had begun to understand something about Luca. He rarely stared at what people wanted him to see. He watched what happened after. The explanation. The hesitation. The breath someone took before speaking. Those were the places where cracks lived. Finally, Luca handed the wine slip back to the table. "We're done for tonight." Richard nodded too quickly. Relief flashed through his eyes before disappearing. Grace saw it. Luca saw it too. She knew because his gaze lingered half a second longer. The meeting dissolved. Board members collected folders. Chairs slid across carpet. Expensive shoes disappeared into expensive hallways. Yet as Grace turned toward the door, Luca's voice stopped her. Miss Holloway. She looked back. Bring me everything you've kept. Silence settled again. Richard's smile vanished. 20 minutes later, Grace sat alone inside a private office overlooking the Chicago skyline. Rain streaked the glass 30 floors above the city. A lamp cast a pool of amber light across a dark wooden desk. Her stained apron rested folded beside her. The wine slip sat next to it. Across the room, Luca stood near the window speaking quietly into his phone. He ended the call and approached without hurry. Everything. Grace nodded. Then she reached into her bag and removed the first item. The cocktail napkin. Cream-colored. Faint blue residue still visible beneath the fibers. Then came the altered wine slip. Then her cracked phone with photographs of the schedule board. Luca studied each item without comment. No reaction. No judgment. Nothing. Grace wondered if she had imagined the significance of all of it. Then she remembered something. There's one more thing. She unfolded her apron. Carefully. Inside the inner pocket, hidden beneath the torn seam, rested a small black USB drive. Luca's eyes narrowed slightly. The smallest movement she'd seen from him all night. Where did you get that? It wasn't mine. Grace swallowed. I found it after someone searched my locker. Luca held out his hand. The drive looked ordinary. Cheap plastic. No label. Yet the room somehow felt colder once it sat on the desk between them. A technician arrived 15 minutes later. Middle-aged. Silent. Trusted. The contents loaded onto a monitor. Security footage. Hallway cameras. Service entrances. Storage rooms. Dozens of clips. Then they found it. A 7-minute gap. Exactly 7 minutes missing from camera 12. The camera covering the VIP beverage station. The footage ended at 7:05 p.m. and resumed at 7:12 p.m. The exact time stamped on the altered wine order slip. Nobody spoke. The technician cleared his throat. Corruption like this doesn't happen naturally. Luca remained silent. Grace watched his reflection in the monitor. Still. Dangerous. Thinking. Then another file appeared. An archived service log. One line caught Grace's eye immediately. She leaned forward. Wait. The technician paused playback. Grace pointed. Zoom in. A digital beverage authorization record filled the screen. One bottle. One approval. One electronic signature.
Richard Hale.
The room fell silent again. The technician frowned. That doesn't prove anything. Richard managed beverage logistics for major events. Perfectly reasonable. Perfectly normal. Luca said nothing. But Grace noticed something. He wasn't looking at Richard's name anymore. He was looking at the timestamp. 7:08 p.m. Then his gaze shifted toward the rain-dark skyline beyond the glass. Somewhere far away. Somewhere years ago. Interesting, he said quietly. Grace had the strange feeling the word meant the opposite. What's interesting? Luca's eyes remained on the screen. Richard was with me at 7:08. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Luca reached forward and paused the image himself. Not on Richard's signature. On the administrator who approved it. The second authorization belonged to Evelyn Cross. The second authorization belonged to Evelyn Cross. Nobody in the office reacted immediately. The rain tapped softly against the glass 30 stories above Chicago. Somewhere behind them, an air vent hummed. The city kept moving. But inside the room, something had shifted. Luca stared at the screen for several long seconds. Then he stood. Not abruptly. Not angrily. Quietly. That was somehow worse. Grace had expected disbelief. Maybe an argument. Maybe a demand for explanations. Instead, Luca picked up his phone and made a single call. Get me Dr. Rosen. He ended the call before anyone could ask questions. The technician looked uncomfortable. Mr. Moretti, an administrative approval doesn't necessarily mean involvement. Luca nodded once. I know. His voice was calm, cold. That's why we're not making assumptions. 30 minutes later, a private physician arrived through a side entrance carrying a hard case. The wine sample, the cocktail napkin, the residue from the glass. Everything was taken without fanfare. No police. No accusations. No headlines. Just evidence moving quietly through trusted hands. Grace watched from a chair near the window. For the first time all night, exhaustion settled into her bones. She thought about her father asleep across town in a memory care facility. About the unpaid hospital invoices folded inside her kitchen drawer. About the collection notices arriving every month with her name printed in bold black letters. People always assumed she wanted money, payout, a reward, a shortcut out of debt. They never understood that some things became heavier than money. Lies did. Dr. Rosen left shortly before midnight. Luca's attorney arrived 10 minutes later. Then a retired accountant. Then a security consultant who had worked for the family nearly 20 years. One by one they entered the office. One by one they received quiet instructions. Review access logs. Reopen archived files. Pull medical records. Compare signatures. Nobody asked why. Nobody raised their voice. The danger came from how methodical it all felt. Grace eventually stood. I should go. Luca looked up from a stack of personnel files. Why? The question surprised her. She hesitated. Because this isn't my world. Silence. Then she reached into her purse and removed a folded hospital bill. Creased. Worn. The paper had been opened so many times it was soft around the edges. She set it on the desk. You know what everybody thinks? Luca waited. They think I saw something tonight because I wanted something. Her fingers rested lightly on the bill. I don't want money. The room remained quiet. Then what do you want? Grace swallowed. I want people to stop deciding what's true based on who says it. The words hung between them. Simple. Heavy. Luca glanced down at the bill. Not the amount. The name. Grace Holloway. Then he looked away, almost as if the paper embarrassed him. Her phone buzzed suddenly on the desk. A text notification flashed across the screen. The sender's name was unfamiliar. The message contained only 7 words. Stop asking questions about table 14. Grace's stomach tightened. The message vanished almost immediately, deleted remotely before she could open it. Luca noticed. Of course he did. He held out his hand. Grace gave him the phone. His security consultant examined it. Spoofed relay. The man frowned. Professional. Another silence followed. Then the attorney cleared his throat. Mr. Moretti. He slid an old personnel folder across the desk. Yellowed paper. 12 years old. Luca opened it. Inside sat a visitor authorization record from the year his father died. One signature. One name. Evelyn Cross. Not as a fiancé. Not as a philanthropist. As an administrative intern assigned to the hospital wing during the final week of his father's life. Luca stared at the page longer than he had stared at anything all night. When he finally looked up, the coldness in his eyes wasn't aimed at Evelyn. It was aimed at himself. Because for the first time, he realized he had spent 12 years questioning strangers while never once questioning the woman he trusted most. For several seconds after reading the personnel file, nobody spoke. The city lights shimmered through rain beyond the glass, turning Chicago into a blur of gold and silver. Luca closed the folder carefully. Not slammed. Not tossed aside. Closed. The movement felt deliberate enough to make everyone else in the room sit straighter. Schedule the engagement dinner, he said. The attorney blinked. Sir. Friday night. Luca slid the file across the desk. Invite everyone. Grace looked up sharply. Evelyn's name sat in the folder like a lit match, and Luca was planning a dinner. The security consultant looked equally confused. Only Luca seemed calm. People tell the truth when they think they've already won. 2 nights later, the private dining room overlooking Lake Michigan glowed with candlelight and polished crystal. Board members attended. Charity donors attended. Senior staff attended. Evelyn arrived wearing midnight blue silk and a smile bright enough to blind cameras. If she felt any concern, she hid it perfectly. Grace worked service beside the wall. Invisible again. Or at least that was what everyone assumed. A camera no larger than a shirt button blinked quietly from inside a floral arrangement near the center of the table. Nobody noticed. Except Luca. Except Grace. A server placed wine before each guest. Luca did not touch his glass. Evelyn noticed that too. "You seem distracted tonight." Her tone was affectionate. Concerned. The perfect fiancé. Luca folded his hands. "Busy week. You should rest." Her smile never wavered. "Stress changes people." Across the room, Grace felt a chill. Those were almost the exact words Evelyn had used on her. Stress changes people. Overwhelmed. Emotional. The same script delivered to different audiences. Luca tilted his head slightly. "You said that to Grace." For the first time all evening, Evelyn hesitated. "Barely." "Did I?" "Something similar." Silence settled briefly over the table. Then conversation resumed. Most people missed it. Grace did not. She remembered voices the way other people remembered faces. An hour later, dessert arrived. Coffee followed. Luca stood and thanked everyone for attending. Then he lifted a sealed envelope from the table. Thick cream paper. Untouched all evening. "Before we finish, I'd like clarification on one small issue." Nobody moved. Evelyn's smile held. "What issue?" Luca removed a single wine order slip. The altered one. He placed it on the table between them. Table 14. The room became very quiet. Evelyn glanced down. Only for a moment. Then she laughed softly. "Surely we're past that misunderstanding." "Probably." Luca nodded. "But humor me." He slid a pen across the table. "Tell everyone whose handwriting this is." A simple request. Innocent. Reasonable. The kind nobody should fear. Yet Grace saw Evelyn's fingers pause before touching the pen. A tiny hesitation. Less than a second. Across the room, one board member shifted uncomfortably. Another looked toward the door. The camera light inside the flowers continued blinking. Evelyn studied the slip. "I can't tell from a photocopy." "It's the original." Luca's voice remained calm. "Then I still can't tell." Another silence. Longer this time. Grace watched Evelyn carefully. Something finally felt different. Not panic. Not yet. But calculation. Then Grace noticed a detail no one else seemed to see. Evelyn wasn't looking at the signature. She was looking at the crossed-out table number on the back. Table 9. The number she shouldn't have known was there because nobody had mentioned it. Luca noticed the same thing. Grace knew he had because his eyes never left Evelyn's face. "Interesting," he said quietly. The single word landed like a stone in still water. Evelyn set the slip down. "I don't know what you're implying." "Neither do I." Luca offered a faint smile. "Not yet." The dinner ended 20 minutes later. Guests departed. Chairs emptied. Candle flames flickered against dark windows. Evelyn collected her purse near the doorway and turned toward the hall. Then she stopped. Across the room, Grace was standing beside Luca's security consultant reviewing footage from the hidden camera. For the first time since this began, Evelyn's smile disappeared completely. The next evening, the ballroom looked exactly as it had on the night everything began. The same crystal chandeliers. The same polished floors. The same white linen tablecloths. The same raised platform where donors praised generosity beneath Luca Moretti's name. Even the same table sat at the center of the room. Table 14. Grace stood near the back wall holding a slim black folder against her chest. Months ago she would have looked down when people stared. Tonight she didn't. The room filled slowly. Charity board members. Attorneys. Executives. Reporters invited under the pretense of an annual funding announcement. Evelyn arrived last. Elegant as always. Calm as always. She greeted guests. Kissed cheeks. Accepted compliments. If she noticed the tension beneath the evening, she gave no sign. Luca waited until everyone was seated before stepping to the front. No speech. No introduction. Just silence. The room gradually quieted around him. "Before we discuss next year's projects," he said, "there's something that needs to be corrected." A screen descended behind him. Several board members exchanged confused glances. Evelyn remained composed. "Luca," she said softly, almost amused. "What is this?" He looked at her for a long moment. "The truth." Nobody moved. Grace felt the weight of the folder in her hands. Luca nodded once toward her. Not a rescue. Not permission. Recognition. Grace walked forward. The same room that had laughed when wine spilled across her apron now. Watched every step she took. She placed the folder on the table. Opened it. Removed the first document. The altered wine slip. Then the second. The executive access records. Then the security report showing the missing 7 minutes. One piece after another. Carefully. Methodically. Nobody interrupted. "You can't prove intent from paperwork," Evelyn said gently. "Administrative errors happen every day." Reasonable. Calm. Convincing. Several people visibly relaxed. Then Grace removed a flash drive. The room became quiet again. "The backup wasn't on the restaurant system," she said. Her voice remained steady. "It was hidden inside a deleted archive." Evelyn's smile faltered. Barely. Grace connected the drive. Security footage appeared on the screen. The VIP beverage station. The timestamp. The missing 7 minutes restored. Someone entered the frame. Not a bartender. Not a server. Evelyn's assistant. Carrying a bottle. The footage continued. Another figure appeared. Evelyn herself. No audio. Just images. Yet the room seemed unable to breathe. "That's out of context," Evelyn said immediately. "You don't know what was being discussed." Grace didn't answer. Instead, she opened the final file. Audio. The recording began with static. Then voices. A conversation captured from a phone backup recovered from the assistant's cloud account. Evelyn's voice emerged first. Clear. Undeniable. "No one notices gradual symptoms. That's why it has to look natural." The room froze. Nobody looked at the screen anymore. They looked at her. The recording continued. References to authorizations. Hospital access. The death 12 years earlier. Every sentence stripped away another layer. Luca lowered his eyes. Not because he doubted the evidence. Because he recognized the voice. The same voice that had sat beside him at charity dinners. The same voice he had trusted with family secrets. The same voice he had defended. When the recording ended, nobody spoke. Not immediately. Even Evelyn said nothing. For the first time, she seemed unable to find the correct version of herself. Then Luca reached into the folder and removed a yellowed hospital authorization form. The intern's signature from 12 years ago. Her signature. He stared at it for several seconds. Grace saw something break behind his eyes. Not rage. Regret. "I signed recommendations based on your reports," he said quietly. "I ignored questions because I trusted you." The words landed harder than any accusation. Evelyn opened her mouth. Closed it again. Around them, people looked away. Ashamed. Not of what had happened. Of how long they had helped pretend it hadn't. Luca stepped forward. He placed the hospital form on top of the folder and looked toward his attorney. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. "Call my attorney." No one moved after Luca spoke. The ballroom seemed suspended between two versions of itself. The old one built on reputation, appearances, and carefully protected lies. And the new one forming in the silence around a folder full of evidence. Then the attorneys began making calls. Board members lowered their eyes. Reporters quietly stepped outside to contact editors. Reality started moving again. Just not in the direction anyone had expected. Within 48 hours, the charity's accounts were frozen pending investigation. Independent auditors were brought in. The board voted unanimously to remove Evelyn from all leadership positions. Donations were suspended. Internal records were seized. The engagement announcement disappeared from every company website before sunrise. There were no dramatic arrests in front of cameras. No shouting. No scenes. Just consequences arriving one signature at a time. The kind that lasted longer. Grace watched most of it from a distance. She returned to work 2 days later because bills still arrived and life had a habit of continuing even after the truth exploded. The restaurant looked the same. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. Servers hurried between tables. Glasses clinked. Orders were shouted through swinging doors. Yet people looked at her differently now. Some smiled awkwardly. Others couldn't meet her eyes. A few offered apologies. One hostess stopped her near the employee entrance. "I should have said something that night." Grace recognized her immediately. She had laughed when the wine spilled.
"I'm sorry."
The apology was small, imperfect, real. Grace nodded. Sometimes that mattered more than speeches. A week later, Richard Hale submitted his resignation. The investigation revealed altered staffing records, falsified approvals, and years of administrative cover-ups. Several executives followed him out the door. The restaurant's ownership group launched a full review of employee complaints that had been ignored for years. Missing overtime,
Withheld tips.
shift manipulation, problems people had dismissed because the complaints came from people wearing aprons instead of suits. Luca ordered every case reopened. Not because lawyers demanded it, because he finally understood how many warnings had been buried simply because of who delivered them. One rainy afternoon, Grace arrived at the memory care facility carrying a folder of her own. Updated insurance documents, restored coverage, legal protections arranged through a foundation that now operated under independent oversight.
No publicity. No cameras.
No press release with Luca's name attached. Just help done correctly. Her father's medical bills no longer arrived in threatening envelopes. For the first time in years, she opened her mailbox without fear. A month later, Luca asked her to meet him before opening hours. The dining room sat empty. Morning sunlight stretched across polished floors. Chairs rested upside down on tables. The quiet felt peaceful instead of dangerous. He led her toward the front entrance. Near the hostess stand stood a glass display case that hadn't been there before. Grace stopped walking. Inside sat an old black apron. Her apron, the same one stained with wine, the same one people had laughed at. The torn seam had been repaired. Carefully, beneath it rested a small engraved plaque. Grace read the words twice. The woman who refused to look away. For several seconds she couldn't speak. Luca stood beside her with his hands in his pockets. The staff voted on it. Grace smiled despite herself. "You had nothing to do with it?" "Almost nothing." The answer was so dry it made her laugh. The sound surprised both of them. They stood there quietly for a moment. Then Luca handed her a new employee badge. Not waitress, not server, Director of Food Safety and Compliance. Her name printed correctly beneath the title. Grace Holloway. Nothing else. No explanation needed. She looked at it for a long time before slipping it into her pocket. Later that evening, after the dinner rush ended, she sat alone at a corner table with a cup of hot coffee warming her hands. Through the dining room glass, she could see the old apron displayed beneath soft lights. Once it had been evidence of humiliation. Now it stood as proof that being ignored and being wrong were never the same thing. Luca passed by on his way out. He paused. "Anything else you need?" Grace glanced toward the display case, then back at him.
No.
She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I just wanted someone to listen." Luca said nothing after that. He simply nodded once and walked away. And for the first time in a very long while, the woman everyone had overlooked knew the truth had finally become louder than power.